Brilliant. Thanks, Kate, and welcome everybody to this last day of Social Work Week in what is going to be, I'm sure, an absolute cracking event. And we're really, really pleased to have you all this Friday morning to discuss practice education and developments in practice education and how we can best support and recognise what is such a critical role. My name is Natalie Day. I'm Assistant Director for Policy and Strategy at Social Work England, and I'm going to ask my panellists to join us now quickly just to introduce themselves so you've got a bit of a flavour of what to expect over this morning where we'll be discussing practice education. So I'm going to throw to you, Vanessa, just to say hello and your title.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Vanessa Goldsmith, and I am one of the practice leads at the University of Chester.
Brilliant. Thanks, Vanessa. And Mark?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Gregory. I'm a lecturer in social work at the University of East Anglia, also a registered practice educator myself.
Excellent. And last but not least, Rebecca.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Rebecca Bramall. I'm an effective practice consultant and practice educator over in East Riding Children's Services.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. So, as I said, we've got a cracking morning today of a little bit of slides to share, some research that Mark's going to share with us, and also I'm going to share some of the findings from our recent survey, which I'm sure a number of you filled in about practice education from Social Work England. So I'll share some of the top headlines from that survey, and then as Kate said, do start thinking about your questions because we want to open up to the panel and have a really rich discussion this morning about how best we can support practice education. So I'll throw over to Mark now, but hopefully you've got a coffee in hand and Mark can share some of the findings of the research that we were really pleased to commission last year. So over to you, Mark.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Natalie. So yeah, I'm going to talk you through a piece of research that I undertook with colleagues at the University of East Anglia last year. It's actually the second piece of practice educator research that I've been involved with Social Work England, having undertaken a bit of research with other colleagues at UEA back in 2023. So this piece of research was looking specifically at training for practice educators in England. So getting a bit of a sense of what the landscape of practice educator training looked like to inform Social Work England's ongoing work in considering their role with practice educators and practice education. So we undertook the work between March and June last year. So it was quite a rapid project. And we had 4 strands of work that we engaged in. One was to do a rapid evidence review of existing research, so looking at what literature already existed in relation to practice educator training. We then did a desk-based review of existing courses. We did a desk-based review of approaches in the other UK nations to look at comparisons there. We undertook some regional focus groups with stakeholders, so practice educators, universities and other stakeholders. And I'm going to present to you today some of the findings from the desk-based review of existing courses and the regional focus groups with stakeholders. I haven't got much time, so it's going to be a very quick kind of run through some of the things that we found. So from the desk-based research, we mined information from across the 9 regions of England. So my colleagues on the research team each took 3 regions each, and what we did was we looked at university websites to get a sense of the kind of practice educator courses that they offered. We did some good old-fashioned kind of Googling to find any other approaches that we used, and what we found was that 45 HEIs in England deliver courses directly, while a further 10 HEIs also support practice educator training delivery by other methods. So usually that's in combination with a teaching partnership in their area or with particular local authorities that work in their area. So they have a role either in delivering content or quality assuring alongside other partners. We found it was quite a complex picture, so there was a lot of variance in how practice educator training was delivered. We found that there was a mixture of traditional HEI delivery, so that was where social workers would come on accredited courses at a university. They would get an academically recognised amount of credits for doing the course, and at the end of it would be qualified as practice educators. We found that in some areas delivery was led by local authorities, so local authorities actually delivered the training themselves, usually with some input from HEIs in a quality assurance role, but the delivery was very much led by the local authorities. We also found approaches where large teaching partnerships, either formal teaching partnerships or informal teaching partnerships, delivered practice educator training in their region. And we also found that there was a combination of the above in some regions. So in some regions, there was a mixture of traditional HEI delivery, but also some partnership working as well. And there was a real mix of accredited, so university-based courses offering academic credits, non-accredited courses usually delivered by local authorities or teaching partnerships, and part accredited routes where some of the qualification for a practice educator would be delivered by a HEI and would come with academic credits, and some of it would be delivered by the local authority or teaching partnership and wouldn't come with academic credits. So we found most variation between courses on the split of courses offering combined delivery of the two stages of the PEPs. So as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, the PEPs are split into stage 1 and stage 2, and training can be offered either by a split stage, so offering stage 1 and stage 2 separately, or you can offer a combined PEPs 1 and PEPs 2 course as well. What we found was 58% of courses offered a split stage approach, so offering the PEPs 1 and PEPs 2 training separately. 27% offered the PEPs 1 and PEPs 2 combined as a course, and 15% of providers only offered PEPs 2 training. So that was usually where the local authority would provide the PEPs 1 level training, and the HEI would then offer a top up to PEPs 2. We found significant variation in fees for practice educator training, ranging from completely free to users all the way up to £4,000 for a 60 credit postgraduate certificate in practice education. So really significant variance there. Variance in the method of delivery between hybrid generally and fully in-person teaching. So it was around a level split between those who were offering hybrid delivery and those who were offering in-person. There was a very small number, only 5% of the courses we found were entirely online. So there was a preference for at least some face-to-face delivery. There was real variation in the number of academic credits, so some courses weren't accredited at all, whereas some offered up to 60 academic credits. And the duration and number of days, there was quite a lot of variation as well, from only sort of 3 months up to over a year for the course to be completed. So some variation there, whereas there was minimal divergence in things like entry requirements. So we found that most courses had the same entry requirements, 2 years post-qualifying as a social worker and those kind of things. Selection criteria and course content were also quite similar, which is not surprising because those things tend to be covered in the PEPs guidance. So it was not surprising that we saw less variation there. So we held focus groups with 72 participants across 6 focus groups. We had 2 focus groups in each of the areas. So we broke the regions down into kind of 3 bigger areas so that we could get people kind of talking with people who are working in a similar area of the country to them. 51 of the participants were working in local authorities or trusts and were either practice educators or were involved in practice education in some other way, supporting practice education or supporting practice placements within their organisation. We had 20 HEI staff and 1 independent practice educator. So what we were exploring was the experiences of current training, including strengths and weaknesses, links between practice educator training and career progression, and future directions for practice educator training. I'm going to focus on the first and third of those. The links between practice educator training and career progression were interesting, but I haven't really got time to go into those in great depth today. The very kind of short headline there is that actually practice educator training was often seen as a gateway into supervision and management roles within organisations. And that was a bit of a double-edged sword because it sometimes meant people were then lost to the practice educator workforce, even though it benefited them in terms of their own career progression. So in terms of views on existing provision, we identified 4 themes in relation to existing provision. 2 were largely positive and 2 less positive. So in terms of structure and content, participants were generally really positive about the structure and content of practice educator training. They particularly liked that the PEPs refresh had a real focus on anti-racist practice and on adult learning. So really kind of centering those important parts of practice education. And people also liked the fact that the PEPs provided a framework for practice educator training, but it wasn't overly rigid. So that meant that there was some flexibility allowed within how practice educator training was delivered, and we saw lots of different approaches used across the regions, and this was something that the participants that we spoke to valued. They liked the fact that they could adapt the practice educator training, how it was delivered to meet their local need. The flip side of that flexibility was that there were concerns about consistency and quality assurance of practice educator training. So where there's real variance in the way that practice educator training is delivered, it's much more difficult to then have consistency across programs, across regions, let alone across the country. And it means that there's not necessarily robust quality assurance in place, particularly as the PEPs provides a framework rather than regulation of practice education. So it doesn't actually have any teeth to enforce the quality that it's trying to ensure through its through the standards that it provides. Another issue was around support and sufficiency for practice educator training. So concerns about people not always progressing all the way through their practice educator training because they weren't well supported by their organisations, and actually maintaining a good number of practice educators was also an issue. Some people being lost to management posts, and some people simply not having the time and the capacity to carry on offering placements after they qualified. In terms of the future directions for practice educator training, again, we identified 4 themes, which had some relation to the strengths and the weaknesses that we identified when exploring current experiences of practice educator training. So one of the things that people felt was really essential was for practice educator training to focus on supporting diverse learners in a complex landscape. There was a real acknowledgement that social work is becoming more and more complex. There's no such thing as a straightforward case in social work these days, and we're putting students into situations where they're working with this increased level of need and increased level of complexity, and that presents challenges. Similarly, we're seeing that the social work student cohorts are becoming more complex in terms of their needs as well. So we're seeing a lot of neurodiversity and a lot of other needs amongst social work students, and they felt that actually it was really important that practice educators were well equipped to support students with a range of differences and a range of needs. So that was something that people felt was really important. There was a lot of discussion about the benefits of courses being accredited versus non-accredited, and whether or not it was beneficial to have separate stages of the training, or whether it was better to have a combined course, and views on that were really mixed. So some people felt that accreditation helped to offer a degree of quality assurance and consistency, and some people liked the idea of having a combined PEPS 1 and PEPS 2 course, whereas others felt that they liked having the separation of the courses, that it allowed for more progress and development from stage 1 to stage 2, and others also wanted to have the flexibility to not necessarily offer accredited HEI based courses, because not everyone wants to engage in further education in higher education and doing more formal learning. Other people prefer to engage with less formal learning. So there was a real mixture of views on whether or not accreditation was beneficial. Consistency, quality assurance and ongoing learning was an area where there was generally more agreement. So people were keen for there to be more consistency, for there to be standards that were applicable across the board. They felt that this would enable better quality assurance if there was frameworks that had kind of more teeth to be enforced, and they also felt that by providing more oversight of practice educator training, providing that better quality and consistency, that actually there could also be some consideration of how ongoing learning for practice educators could be built into the system, so that it wasn't just that practice educators do the practice educator training and then that's it, that there'd be opportunities for ongoing learning and development after they qualify. But people were also really keen to avoid too much upheaval. So if there is to be more regulation and oversight of practice educator training, then they were really keen that we didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, that actually we kept some of the things that were working really well currently, and didn't create massive changes that potentially risk jeopardizing what is already quite a precarious workforce. So one of the things that I found in this research and in the previous research that I did with colleagues was that people are worried about how precarious the practice educator workforce is. It faces an awful lot of challenges in terms of workload pressures on practice educators, remuneration for practice educators not being what perhaps it could be, and actually with that precarity in the workforce, we don't want to necessarily introduce things that are going to cause more issues for practice educators. So it's about striking a balance in any approach that brings in greater quality assurance and consistency, not making that too burdensome and onerous for people on the practice educator training courses. So overall, it was very much a highly complex landscape, lots of different methods of delivery of practice educator training. We found that there was an appetite for change, for there to be a bit more kind of consistency brought in for practice educator training, a bit more oversight to make sure that the quality was there. But that was tempered by not wanting to have too much change and not introducing changes that were going to be really burdensome and that were going to potentially have a negative impact on the practice educator workforce. People liked the existing frameworks. They were positive generally about the PEPS refresh that took place in 2022 and some of the things that had introduced, while acknowledging that it had limitations for only being a framework rather rather than actually being something with regulatory teeth. And what we found as well from the work that we did with other nations of the UK was that we can learn from their approaches where there is a bit of closer integration between the regulator and between how practice educator training is delivered, where resources are provided by a central organisation in some of the other nations to help practice educators to not only qualify but then to maintain their knowledge as well. And actually there were some really interesting regional approaches that that we could learn from too, as well as being able to learn from what's currently in place for AMP programmes and BIA programmes where Social Work England has oversight and approves those courses. So that's a very, very quick run through from me. I'm now going to hand back over to Natalie before we move on to the panel discussion.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. And thanks very much for such a quick whistle-stop tour through what was a really comprehensive piece of research. And I know my colleagues have put that in the chat so people can clear their weekend diaries and catch up on some of the latest research on practice education. But we were really pleased to do this research at Social Work England, in part because, as Mark's sort of alluded to, this is an area of social work practice where the evidence base is somewhat lacking in many ways. And we didn't have a comprehensive picture of what was sort of happening in the broader education landscape for practice education and how that was placed around the country. And Mark's research and that of the team really has helped to kind of feed into that evidence base and give us a much richer understanding of the lay of the land when it comes to practice education and how that is sort of and how that is quite a complex picture across the country and quite different models and methods of which practice education training is developed. So huge thanks to Mark and the team for that work. I'm just going to very quickly, as mentioned, talk about some of the work that we've done that builds on Mark's research in terms of our more recent survey of practice education. Again, all part of this sort of considered effort to put more focus on the practice education role, to try and understand what the sort of state of play is there, and also to try and really sort of think about what extra support or levers or other things might we as the regulator or other players do in order to better support what is such a critical role in the social education kind of ecosystem. So very quickly, I'm going to share, I'm not sure that we've shared these too widely yet. So, hot off the press, I've got some of the headlines from our recent survey. We were absolutely delighted with the response to this survey. I think it was the fastest and the most well-received survey that we've ever done at Social Work England. The response within minutes of opening this survey was like Glastonbury. It was just, incredible in terms of the feedback and the willingness to engage and to get involved with this. So for those that are aware, in January we did do this survey. We asked all social workers on our register about their experiences of practice education. And as mentioned, we had over 4,400 social workers responded. And this has given us, again, just helps to provide that evidence base through which to think about the role of practice education and what's happening out there on the ground. So this gives you a quick sort of headline of those that have, that question of have you ever supported a student on placement as a practice educator? And of those 4,000, 54% said yes. Obviously 33% said no, and then some 13% said, only sort of during training. When we asked them what sort of training people had, the overwhelming number, 53%, had used the PEEPs, which Mark referred to. But there's also sort of some others that had, some practice teaching awards or a combination. And then there was that sort of 9% that couldn't remember the name of their training. And a small percentage of people said that they'd had no practice educator training at all, or they couldn't remember if they'd trained. And then 8% sort of said that they'd had this sort of other training. So it's just interesting there in terms of that mixed picture that Mark described in terms of the training landscape for practice education, which I think the survey bears witness to there. When we tried to understand the kind of currency, the challenges and the future intentions of those practice educators, because we hear very anecdotally about practice educators maybe not being in the role for very long, maybe being a practice educator being seen as a sort of stepping stone to further management roles, etc. We wanted to kind of probe a bit more into that as part of the survey. So of the sort of 1,293 practice educators who told us that they had a student within the last 2 years, I think quite a stark number, 18.7% of those were unsure whether they would continue to practice in the role of practice educator or whether they may have already been thinking about leaving the role. So some real challenges there about whether they would, continue to take on to continue being practice educators. And some of the biggest challenges, which I perhaps will resonate with listeners here, were around things like capacity, access to training, perhaps their own personal circumstances, that sort of recognition or lack of recognition, support for the role and their kind of well-being, as well as one there, which is, capacity is obviously the largest response there, but the other is financial. And I think we're all recognize that people don't go into practice educators to sort of become millionaires. It's not that kind of role, but financial pressures is one that was certainly mentioned in terms of the challenges facing the role. And then, I think we're also looking at, many people that told us that they hadn't supervised a student for quite some time, and that they, 26.4%, they didn't plan to return to that role, or they're really, almost 40% unsure that they'd ever do that again. And some of the reasons there, not dissimilar around personal circumstances. Again, capacity comes out loud and clear here, alongside issues of support, well-being, etc. So some really interesting themes there in terms of the currency of practice. And one of the challenges that we have that we're trying to sort of grapple with is that, currently we don't have a sense of the currency of the practice education workforce. And so that's one of the things that we're kind of grappling with as the regulator. When we ask practice educators through this survey, what does recognition mean? If we were to think about how best to better support the practice educator role, people did talk quite loudly about financial recognition. That as we said, this is not often something that is associated with the role. Others talked about, getting better support from colleagues or management. Others talked, a large one there, 20% of respondents talked about feeling valued or having others understand or appreciate the role of practice education more clearly. So again, just being much clearer and articulate about the role of practice education and how vital it is to the future sort of pipeline of the profession. And that's something that we're really interested in exploring. Recognition here also, people talked about career progression and leadership, and also that need to have the time and space to do the role well, which I think links really closely to sort of colleague or management support for understanding the vital importance of the practice educator role. There was some talk about a sort of standardized national qualification, and also the kind of need to or the potential to explore whether a recognition or a record as part of the social work register, perhaps through annotation or other means, might be a path to greater recognition for the role. And again, that's something that we've been picking up in the various workshops that we've held on practice education across the country in recent months, where we've been really sort of grappling with some of these questions about what could recognition look like if it was on the register, how would that work, what sort of values would that provide, and also what might be some of the drawbacks of those approaches. And then the final one here is just access to CPD, and we at Social Work England are conducting a review of CPD at the moment, and we are, as part of that, looking at how we can best support specialist practice and whether there's a possible route there through CPD that could be of value to practice education. Again, all exploratory at this stage, but really, really helpful to explore that. We had some really, really helpful comments in some of the through some of our engagement, whether it's the workshops or the surveys, that I think gives you just a flavour of some of the passion that sits underneath the practice educator role. And I'm sure you'll see some of that in our chat today with the panelists. But people just talked about how they just loved, I do find when you meet practice educators, and I'm sure in the audience here, they are so passionate about the power of their role and the capacity to, really help support the next generation of social workers. So quotes here about loving to watch students' confidence grow, about how they themselves were able to revisit all the theory and education behind social work and sort of relive their sort of student days in some way, but really sort of picking up how this role is so crucial to the future of the profession, and it's a benefit to the student and the practice educator to play this role. So some of those themes I think are really powerful and hopefully resonate with you, the audience. There was some discussion in these various events and engagement activities about how practice education is impacted by setting and by sector. So, we had experiences from the community mental health team, where they're supporting student mental health students that need support on placements, and how it had been challenging at times to arrange shadowing opportunities. So, we talked as part of this about what are some of the challenges, and Mark talked about the kind of complex landscape that practice education now works in, and I think that kind of came through in much of the sort of the realities of being a practice educator that we heard through our survey results. We also heard about how local infrastructure and partnerships make a big difference. And I think, Vanessa and others may draw on this today, that we know in the sort of Manchester region, that kind of teaching partnership approach provides a really rich ecosystem through which to support practice education, and that collaboration between a local authority and higher education institutes, who are all so committed to kind of the review and the development of appropriate training programs, and really sort of supporting the practice educator, the student, the employer, through a really kind of collaborative approach based on mutual respect, being the kind of a really kind of key way of supporting practice education, and perhaps a kind of signal of best practice that we might tap into today in terms of how best to support and nurture the practice education environment. And that final quote there about how it takes a village to support student placements, again, just thinking about that whole team contribution, that when practice education and a practice educator role is working really well, it's within that sort of broader context of a whole team that's thinking about that student learning, that student journey, and also just supporting so that the placement is as rich and diverse, and really does equip that student to go on and be a brilliant social worker, and to thrive in their role, and to support people throughout their lives, in whether they go into children or adults or wherever that might be. And that can't just sort of sit solely with one practice educator, as the quote suggests. It takes a village to be able to support that. So those are just some of the themes that we heard throughout our engagement, which I think have been really, really helpful for us at Social Work England as we've been thinking about what might we do in practice education. That's part of the reason why we've been holding all these events and all these surveys that we've been sort of conducting over the last year or so, and now into this next year, a real focus on practice education at Social Work England. And some of the key questions that we're going to sort of put to the panel, and that we've been testing through all of our events and our other activities this year, that we're really sort of trying to think best about what more we could do as the regulator, but also what can others do, is what some of the themes that we're looking to explore today and through this broader program of work is how can we better, building on what we know from Mark's research and from the survey answers and from the engagement activities, how can we better recognise and support the practice educator role? How should or could we support more consistency and coherence in practice educator training? And what support could we as the regulator, but also others, HEIs, employers and others, do to support and provide support for this really, really vital workforce? So we're going to bring the rest of the panel on now, and I'm confident that they'll have answers to some of these questions. And we've also got Q&A coming in now, so please do pop it into the chat, and my colleagues here will help me to sift through those in real time and pose them to the panel. But what we're looking to do now is, I'm going to throw first, I think, to Vanessa to just tell us a bit about, what you think, Vanessa, as a passionate practice educator, we could be doing now to better recognise and support the practice educator role.
Brilliant. Thanks, Natalie. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. I know I've had some issues. Yeah, I mean, that was really interesting to listen to Mark's research, and I guess I sit with two hats on. I have the university HEI perspective from the students, and I also work as part of our local Cheshire Merseyside Social Work Teaching Partnership, delivering PEPs. So I'm there with the practice educators as well. So I see it from both sides. And I think for me, what I'd really like to see change in moving forward is back to basics of what does a local authority placement look like for a student in relation to, you know, for me, it's about retaining our practice educators, and it's also about improving the overall student experience on placements. And I think, you know, already listening to Mark's presentation about how we're in a highly complex landscape, and that we've got increasing complexity of students coming through, I think we need to look at how we're protecting practice educators. We're giving them things that came out in the research around more space and time for practice educators. There's no doubt the passion is there, the passion and the willing and the wanting from our practice educators. We're supporting 100 practice educators a year in our teaching partnership to get through and to get training them. We can't retain them. And for our students, I think what we're seeing from the university perspective is we're seeing that highly complex landscape. And I think sometimes there can be an unrealistic expectation in local authorities on students on placement. So I'd really like to see some support around looking at some guidance about protecting practice educators and students in looking at what consistently does a student placement look like in relation to workload, complexity, lone working, case management. That's what I think would be really highly beneficial. Thank you.
Brilliant, Vanessa. Just a few things there that we're just jotting down frantically in terms of things that we could be doing. So many thanks for that. Rebecca, I'm going to pose the same question to you as a practice educator in terms of what you think in terms of, you know, how we could better recognise and support the role, given your own experience in this space.
So I attended the Manchester forum on the practice educators recently, and I think the thing that stood out for me the most was how inconsistent it was in terms of what everybody's role looked like as a practice educator on a sort of day-to-day basis, what that ongoing training or mentorship was, you know, where they had that they could go to guidance. There was some really beautiful examples of how some local authorities had whole mentorship programs that could support those practice educators if they had any worries or queries or questions, you know, well after the kind of the initial training had happened. But unfortunately, there was then others that had nothing. They were very isolated. They were in roles where they might be the only social worker, never mind the only practice educator within their workplace. So that created a very isolated practice educator, and that again, you know, hugely then impacted on the students' experience that they had for part of their training. So I think there needs to be, you know, more consistency, as you know, as Vanessa said there needs to be more consistency for what it means to be a practice educator. We know there's differences between if you're an on-site practice educator or an off-site practice educator. I'm off-site, so I work really closely with the on-site supervisor, so I've got a really great relationship there. But again, that just brings that village that you talked about there in your slides. It brings that village around students. That I can see that work so beautifully for students. So I think consistency is something that we really need to be thinking about, and about that ongoing wider training, mentoring, advice, guidance, post practice educator training.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rebecca. I mean, I think this theme of consistency, Mark, came up quite a lot in your research in terms of quite mixed consistency, or that's perhaps not even a term, but a lack of consistency across the country when you looked at practice educator training. And there's quite a number of comments in the chat about the sort of role of the peeps and sort of different approaches to training across the country. And I wonder if you might just share a little bit more about what you found about that kind of mixed picture and some of the kind of trade-offs that provides.
Yeah, well, there's definitely, you know, significant variation. As I mentioned, you know, some people were doing kind of a full postgraduate certificate at university. Other people were doing kind of in-house training with their local authority. So real inconsistency in terms of training. From the other research I was involved in, that inconsistency isn't just in the training, you know, it kind of continues afterwards. As Becky kind of pointed out, the level of support that local authorities offer to practice educators really varies. You know, so we saw approaches where there were practice education teams or practice education leads within local authorities who would then support practice educators once they'd qualified, which is a great approach, but not all local authorities are offering that. In terms of how practice educators are paid, that was really variable as well. You know, the payment goes to the placement, and it's then up to them how much they pass on to the practice educator. And we actually found that some local authorities don't pay their practice educators anything for doing practice education, whereas other practice educators do get paid for doing the role. And I think where we've got a situation at the moment where workload relief is a huge issue for practice educators, you know, capacity came up as being the biggest reason why practice educators were reluctant to continue offering placements. A lot of that is down to the fact that there's not really any genuine workload relief attached to being a practice educator. So if you're not going to be given any workload relief, and you're doing this as an addition to your day job, and your local authority then chooses to kind of keep all the money for the student placement and doesn't even offer you a kind of a small honorarium for the work that you're putting in, probably out of hours, then you can see why a lot of practice educators don't necessarily want to remain. So I think there needs to be greater consistency potentially in the training. I think that there are benefits to having that flexibility in the approaches to training, but I think that the consistency is really also important in terms of workload relief and actually, you know, showing that we care about practice educators by actually giving them some money for doing the work that they do.
Thanks, Mark. And there's a couple of questions, quite a number of questions flooding in from the audience. So a massive thanks to you all. Some of them are directed to us as the regulator in terms of our own ambitions in this area. And, you know, I think what we're doing through this work is really sort of just trying to understand the landscape and some of the challenges around the consistency. We absolutely heard loud and clear through the survey, but also through Mark's research around the sort of the desire to avoid any upheaval or any unintended consequences of regulatory action. So we're very mindful that anything that we do in the practice education space needs to be, you know, very, very mindful of the existing pressures. But we are looking at the sort of the qualifications landscape and how that works. I mean, the PEEPS is obviously owned by BASWA. That's not something that we have no sort of regulatory control over the PEEPS, so it's not something that we could oversee. And so we are just sort of generally having conversations with the sector about, you know, what sort of recognition might look like, you know, conversations about annotation. Annotation is not perfect in terms of currency on the register. But if we were to annotate, then we would need to sort of have some oversight of the quality assurance. So there's, you know, so all these are potential levers, and I think we want to work out and discuss with the sector what is proportionate and what would be most helpful to kind of recognizing the fragility of the practice education workforce. How can we best support, but also provide some of that wraparound recognition using the regulatory levers that we might have. So, you know, it's all sort of to discuss at the moment, I think, in terms of how all of these things work. I'd also like to acknowledge that there's some comments here in the chat naturally about placements, and placements do occur outside local authorities. They happen in the voluntary sector and in all types of places. And indeed, we ask for students to have you know, a diverse array of placement experience as part of their training, and we want to acknowledge that. I mean, one of the things that we're looking to do at Social Work England is get under the skin of placements more. We will soon be commissioning some further research to try and just understand the sort of, you know, as part of this broader work, what, you know, around the sort of quality of placements, the sufficiency of placements, perception of placements, to try and understand as part of our broader review of education and training how placements are sort of really working out there, and anything again that we might be able to do in partnership with HEIs and others to kind of support that would be great. Now, in terms of some of the questions coming in, guys, there are some that are sort of talking about, I mean, back to local authorities, they're talking about some of the complex issues and worries of the children and families that they support in local authorities. And in terms of placements, is it best placed, you know, for that final placement to be 100 days? Is that really long enough for students to show that they are then ready to practice? So there's a question there about, you know, how that works in practice, I guess, and whether it's enough. I wonder, Vanessa, if that might be one that you might reflect on.
Thanks, Natalie. So I think for me, what my view on this is that I'm not. There's for many students, 2 placements isn't enough. I think I highly value the voluntary sector. That's my background. But I think the reason why I was mentioning the local authorities previously is that's where the pressures and the complexity of the work tends to be. And our model usually looks at a 70-day placement, the first placement being in the voluntary sector, which is absolutely fantastic in nurturing, supporting our students to develop those soft skills that are required in social work practice. But often that step up from the voluntary sector 70-day placements up to the demands and the complexity of final level local authority placements is huge. So I'm not sure that it's about the length of time. I think that 100-day placement's an adequate length of time if students are at that starting point and there's the correct kind of nurturing and looking again, going back to that kind of effective learning model for students on placements. That would be my view.
Brilliant. Thanks, Vanessa. I think there's a related question here in the comment about some of the shifts in the children's social work around the kind of early career standards and some of the infrastructure that the Department for Education is looking at for those sort of first years of practice. And there's a question here about, do you think that has something to do with the quality of practice education training? That you know, I think there's the question, the audience member might be kind of implying that if practice education training was improved, would that have an impact on those first 2 years of practice? Rebecca, do you have any thoughts on this sort of, I guess it's the journey, a career's journey, and how all these different building blocks, correlate and help a social work student and then a social worker to thrive?
Yeah, I think ultimately, if you've got more consistency throughout the teaching and it's more robust, then our students are finishing their final placement more prepared, more aware of what's to come. They have got that ongoing support throughout their first qualified year, which we know now. We've got that approved social work year with obviously there's changes coming around that as well. I think if we see it as a journey for our students, rather than them just being another worker from day one that can just get thrown in the deep end and be expected to, be the role of a fully fledged social worker when they're not prepared and ready for that. If we see that it's a journey that they need to go on, and that even at the point of finishing second placement, that they've still got lots to learn, and that should continue. Not even just for the first couple of years. I'm 20 years now since I did my qualification, and I'm still learning. So I think social work generally, there needs to be that recognition that we need that ongoing culture of learning to be able to respond to up to date, not just changes to the the way services are working and up to date research, but the changing of needs for our children and our families, how society is changing. And I talk regularly within our ETAF forums around neurodiversity as an example. And I'm also in a part of a forum for neurodivergent social workers, where I see so frequently that understanding and recognition of support's not there, which impacts then on those people feeling confident in practice and being able to necessarily stay in practice long term. Which is someone was undiagnosed for majority of my career, I can see how that has a real impact on wanting to be able to stay in the role and be able to do the role well. But when I've now got understanding of that around myself, I've got understanding from colleagues and management around what that means for me, I can see how that helps me flourish and grow. So that's just one example around neurodiversity training is something that our practice educators need to have to support our students. Obviously disabilities in general, we could go on and on. There's so many more things. I suppose it's looking at our students as whole people. They're not just social workers. We've got whole people to grow. We've got people with lived experience. We need to recognise the impact that has on practice. So it's bigger than just growing social workers. We're growing people that become social workers.
Yeah, absolutely, Rebecca. And I think that's a really powerful point. And you said you'd been a practice educator for 20 years, so you obviously started very, very young.
I've been a social worker for 20 years, not a practice educator. Yeah, social worker for 20 years. But I was 18 when I started my training. I was a baby.
But I guess I wanted to pick up on this point about sort of students, the sort of student population being diverse and also changing. And Mark, this was something that came up in your research, wasn't it, about sort of diverse, more student needs, more complex student needs coming through. Perhaps you could just reflect a bit more about that, and then I'll come to Vanessa to kind of reflect about what that means in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, yeah, similar to what Becky said, there was a recognition from our participants that, we were seeing higher levels of neurodiversity, for example, amongst the student population, and that requires, particular skills on the part of the practice educator to make sure that you're meeting the learning needs of someone who's neurodiverse. But they also mentioned other factors, so things like care experience or lived experience of social work services, that we were seeing, increasing numbers of people in the student population who had maybe had direct experience of social work services themselves growing up, and again, that can require particular kinds of support, when you're supporting someone who's had those life experiences. So there are a range of things that people picked up on that meant that the student population was becoming more complex. I think, just going back to kind of the original question, in a 3-year BA or a 2-year MA, you're never going to end up with a fully formed social worker at the end of it. Social work is just so complex. Where we try to get them to in higher education is to a point that they're ready to enter the profession, and it remains a very steep learning curve for at least the first 2 or 3 years, and the learning continues well beyond that. As Becky said, I'm sort of similar, qualified 17 years ago, and I'm still learning all the time. So it's not, we can't expect that we have fully formed social workers after 2 or 3 years of training. And I don't think necessarily kind of having longer placements or even having better and more consistent practice educator training is necessarily going to change that, because it's just the nature of social work.
Thanks, Mark. And over to you, Vanessa, I guess, just to continue to sort of build on that in your experience. How has practice education changed in your time?
Sure. So I have been a practice educator for over 20 years, and so I've seen a lot of changes in practice education, and then obviously moving into my role within the HEIs. So I think for me the biggest shift has been around expectations on students in placements. What I would love to say is what practice education used to be when I first started, was that students were supernumerary. They were in addition to your core staff team. And hearing now students coming back into university on recall days from placements talking about how they've had opportunities to go shadowing in other teams, they've had that cancelled by managers or practice educators because they are needed within the team that they are on placement, which impacts overall on that student's learning experience, and it's putting the pressure on them to feel that they are working. Hearing language change from students coming back on recall days talking about how, using terms like unpaid, we're on unpaid, placements. We feel like we're working as part of a team. We are working as social workers and just not being paid. We're given all the crap jobs to do. Chronologies, students always talk about, being given chronologies to do. So I think what I'm seeing is a shift away from that valuable, really meaningful learning that students should be having on placement, because they are needed within social work teams. And we talk about the complexity of students coming into our social work training. Certainly see that from within the university. And for practice educators to support those needs, it's not just about skills, but it's about time. And listening to Mark's research, where financial recognition was top with 22%, feeling valued and appreciated was 20%, but what was third with 17% was those practice educators talking about they just need time and space to do the job well. And that's what needs to be recognised, that the whole role of practice education, we've got the passion there. There's no doubt about that within our practice educators, and they want to do it right, but because of all of the demands within their role and the expectations on students, they're struggling to do that. And I see it from both sides.
Absolutely. Thanks, Vanessa. I think you've really sort of struck a nerve there in terms of a lot of the things coming through on the chat as well about time, but also financial issues. So I can see from the audience members that financial issues is coming up as quite a big one. People talking about freelance practice educators who haven't had pay rises for over a decade or more, and how that kind of relates to issues of retention, but also some of the broader things that's happening in the landscape. So you've got DHSC doing the review of bursaries at the moment, and quite a lot of movement, isn't there? A lot of moving parts, and so some challenges that people are identifying, particularly around the financial side, that I think we're certainly wanting to acknowledge that is a genuine issue out there for practice educators and for retaining practice educators. There are some further questions about the sort of expectations around those first couple of years of qualification. So that there's a kind of education standards, there's the PCF, there's the the KSBs for from Skills England, and then also the QAA benchmark for social workers. So there's I think people in social work often talk about this quite crowded landscape. We're very aware of it as the regulator. And I guess there's questions there about how could these all sort of be linked to more kind of consistent experience in practice education training. Mark, I know consistency came up in your research, but I wonder if any panelists had any thoughts on within this crowded landscape, how could we make things easier for practice education training and more consistent and coherent? Everyone's breathing deeply at that particular question. Mark, do you want to kick us off? I'm going to throw you in the deep end.
Yeah,
you
no, that's
started
fine.
to look at this.
I'll start on that. So I think, as you mentioned, it's a crowded landscape, and I think actually some clarity and some consistency. We seem to just kind of end up with more frameworks and more kind of more standards, coming out of the woodwork in social work, and it's been that way for as long as I can remember. Like I say, I've been qualified 17 years and have seen various different frameworks and standards come and go. But we do have several, and I mean it's further complicated by apprentices as well, because they have a whole set of apprenticeship standards that they have to meet. So I think some way of trying to kind of actually streamline some of the standards, and if people are reluctant to kind of get rid of particular frameworks, at least someone doing some work on kind of mapping the standards to each other, so that there is an easy to use tool that enables you to quickly tick off a range of the different standards rather than having to do all that work yourself would be useful. Because it's not to say that the standards that come out are not useful and don't have their place, but when there are so many of them, it does become onerous. And certainly in the first piece of practice educator research bit that I did, that was one of the things that put practice educators off, was the different paperwork they had to use with different HEIs, the different expectations around which sets of standards were having to be evidenced in the paperwork. It was something that was really quite off-putting. So it is something that needs to be looked at, and some way of kind of making it more straightforward for practice educators to assess student practice, and something that then carries over into those first early years in practice as well, I think would be really beneficial.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. I mean, of course, as Social Work England, we obviously hold the education and training standards, the professional standards, and we will also be bringing our knowledge, skills and behaviours framework into regulation as part of the review of education training standards, which we hope to do later in this year. So, we're very mindful of that, and we've been working really closely around with the Trailblazer Group, etc., and others to try and bring our KSBs in line with the apprenticeship to KSBs, and just to be really clear with providers as well about what is regulated against, which is the things that we have regulatory control over. So, but we're always aware of these sort of pressures, and I'm very open to further discussions about it. We only have a few minutes left, and as predicted, we've been overwhelmed by questions, and some really, really interesting ones around sort of quality of placements, around placement experience, around consistency, but also around that kind of complex landscape and qualifications, and that sort of very live question about whether or not there should be greater consistency there. So really, really great stuff. Thanks also to the questions around sort of financial pressures, which I think it is important to recognise that in terms of placements and in terms of practice education. And also, I'd like to acknowledge the various people that have piped in with just acknowledging the diversity of practice education, that you can be an independent practice educator, you can be doing work in local authorities or voluntary sectors, etc. So a huge amount going on there. I guess I want to kind of leave with that kind of one last question for all of our panelists to provide just a very, very short response, which is to ask about, we have discussed today a whole range of things that could happen around practice education, around recognition, around guidance, around consistency, etc. But given the wealth of experience around the room, I mean, what is the sort of one thing that you absolutely think needs to happen in order to wrap around and support this very, very critical workforce? So that's your kind of final pitch on this Friday morning, is to kind of tell us your dream for practice education. What is the one thing you think that would really make the difference in terms of supporting this hugely critical workforce. So Mark, over to you. What's your one wish?
I think, wow, yeah, that's a really tricky one. I think just greater support for practice educators. So in terms of kind of ongoing development opportunities, some form of workload relief, so they actually have more time to do the role that they are passionate about. I think that would be my big one.
Thanks, Mark. Rebecca?
I'm going to go with a personal one. So for me,
Good.
it would be just that understanding and awareness around supporting neurodivergent and disabled social workers so that we can tailor support and not just try and fit everyone in a box with a bog standard approach to learning social work. I think we would get much more out of people if we did that. So everyone is individuals.
Brilliant. I really liked your idea about seeing the whole person as well. And I think that comes through much of what you're saying there and is very to the essence of social work. And Vanessa, last but not least, what's your sort of final pitch for us all?
I think it's following on from Mark, really. It's about practice educators being valued. I mean, I've talked loads about that passion that I see for practice education, and that continues without that recognition and value, you know, so to actually have that, whether it's financially, with time within the wider management structures, that would be amazing.
Brilliant, Vanessa. Well, thank you to Vanessa, to Rebecca, to Mark for your contributions today. We really, really appreciate it. It's been a fantastic discussion, and that passion is, it's no coincidence that Vanessa was on my table at the Manchester Forum, and you know, she blowed me away with her passion from the minute she was there. So and Rebecca was there as well. So hence why they're here today, because I just know that they and Mark's work have been really, really instrumental in sort of thinking about the role of practice education. Today we've given you hopefully an interesting Friday morning. We've shared some of our survey responses. We've shared some of Mark's headlines. You've got the links there in the chat. There's been some questions about where next for this work. This is a priority for us at Social Work England. And over the next year, you'll see and hear more from us in terms of what more we think we could be doing around practice education, whether that's formal recognition through things like annotation, whether that's looking more at the quality assurance side of things, whether there's any particular guidance, accepting it's a crowded landscape. Are there any gaps, as Vanessa or others might have hinted at today, where some guidance about the role of practice education in placements or ways of sharing best practice that might add value? So watch this space, do reach out to us, but we're really, really excited to be focusing on practice education, such a critical role. So huge thanks to you all. Please do fill in the surveys and things from our events. Tell us what you think. And I think I'm handing back to Kate to say farewell, but thank you again, and thank you to our panelists.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. What a great session. I've never seen so many questions come in on a Social Work Week session as that. So a lot of interaction there. It just leaves for me to thank all of you, the audience, for coming along and taking part, posting questions, and being here with us today. Don't forget, if you're a registered social worker, you can use today as a piece of your continuing professional development. You can upload that into your Social Work England account, and it can count towards renewing your registration. This session is recorded. You will find it on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks, along with all the other sessions from Social Work Week 2026. And we've got 3 more sessions today as well. So there are tickets left if you want to come along to further sessions around children's social work, around the Care Act and intimacy, and lastly another session on artificial intelligence. So do jump onto those today if you've got the time. So another big thank you from Social Work England. We hope you've enjoyed this session. Don't forget to fill out the survey, and we'll see you again soon. Many thanks. Bye for now.